There are meetings that never appear on public calendars. Conversations that happen in rooms where recording devices are forbidden. Decisions made by people whose names most Americans couldn't identify, yet whose choices will determine whether those Americans keep their homes, their savings, their way of life. These meetings happen more frequently now. The participants arrive separately, use different entrances, and leave no digital footprints. The Federal Reserve holds these meetings. They call them emergency sessions, off-the-record consultations, crisis preparatory discussions. What they don't call them is what they actually are: rehearsals for collapse. In the summer of 2024, something unprecedented happened. A group of Federal Reserve governors, regional bank presidents, and Treasury officials gathered for what internal documents referred to as a scenario planning exercise. The scenario they were planning for wasn't inflation. It wasn't unemployment. It wasn't even recession. They were planning for the complete breakdown of the dollar-based international monetary system. And they were planning for it to happen in 2026. On the surface, everything looks normal. The stock market continues to reach new highs. Employment numbers appear stable. The Federal Reserve releases its regular statements about monetary policy and economic outlook. Press conferences are held. Questions are answered. The machinery of central banking continues to function exactly as it has for decades. That's exactly what makes this so dangerous. The Federal Reserve has held secret emergency meetings before every major financial catastrophe of the past century. In August 1929, 3 months before the stock market crash, Federal Reserve officials gathered in private to discuss what they called unusual market conditions. Internal transcripts from those meetings, declassified decades later, show they understood exactly what excessive margin lending would do to the system. They knew what was coming. They had the data. They had the warning signs. They said nothing. Some officials even increased their personal cash positions while publicly encouraging Americans to stay invested. In July 2007, 14 months before Lehman Brothers collapsed, Federal Reserve governors held a series of closed-door meetings about subprime mortgage exposure. Internal memos from those meetings, released years later through Freedom of Information Act requests, showed they understood the systemic risk. They knew the banking system was built on a foundation of bad debt. They watched it happen. In March 2020, as the pandemic began to spread, the Federal Reserve didn't just lower interest rates. They held emergency sessions every day for 2 weeks straight. They weren't just responding to the crisis. They were managing a controlled demolition of the economy to prevent something worse. They printed more money in those 2 weeks than had existed in the entire American economy just 50 years earlier. Each time, the pattern was the same: private acknowledgement of catastrophic risk, public assurance that everything was under control, emergency preparation disguised as routine policy. Now look at today. Different century, same mechanics. The 2024 meetings weren't about interest rates or inflation targets. According to sources with knowledge of the discussions, they were about what Federal Reserve officials call the endgame scenario. The moment when America's debt becomes mathematically impossible to service. The moment when foreign creditors stop accepting dollars for real goods. The moment when the petrodollar system that has supported American prosperity for 50 years finally breaks. Meeting participants were presented with classified Treasury projections showing foreign central bank dollar reserves dropping at accelerating rates. China alone has reduced its Treasury holdings by over $400 billion since 2021. Saudi Arabia has quietly begun accepting yuan for oil transactions. These aren't policy adjustments. These are preparations for a post-dollar world. The numbers tell the story the meetings were trying to address. America's national debt now exceeds $34 trillion. The interest payments on that debt consume over $1 trillion annually. That's more than the defense budget, more than Medicare, more than any government program except Social Security itself. But these are just the official numbers. Federal Reserve internal calculations include unfunded liabilities for Social Security and Medicare, pushing the real obligation closer to $200 trillion. That's more than 10 times America's entire economic output. But the real crisis isn't the debt. It's the speed at which that debt is growing. America is adding $2 trillion in new debt every year. At current trajectory, the debt will reach $50 trillion by 2030. The interest payments alone will consume the entire federal budget. This is not a distant threat. This is mathematical certainty. The Federal Reserve knows this. They have economists. They have computers. They can do arithmetic. What they were discussing in those closed sessions wasn't whether this debt spiral would break the system. They were discussing when. And they were discussing what comes next. Sources familiar with the meetings described 3 specific scenarios the Federal Reserve is preparing for. The first is controlled hyperinflation, the systematic destruction of the dollar's purchasing power to reduce the real value of America's debt. This would wipe out savings, destroy fixed incomes, and transfer wealth from creditors to debtors on a scale never seen in modern history. Federal Reserve officials studied the Weimar Republic's playbook in detail. They know that hyperinflation can reduce debt burdens by 90% or more. They also know it can destroy a society. The meetings included discussions about managing social unrest during currency collapse. The second scenario is debt restructuring, a polite term for national bankruptcy. America would declare its debts unpayable and negotiate new terms with creditors. This would end the dollar's status as the world's reserve currency overnight. Every American would wake up in a different country, economically speaking. The Federal Reserve has reportedly been in quiet contact with Chinese and European officials about the mechanics of such a transition. They're discussing not whether it will happen, but how to prevent it from triggering global war. The third scenario is what Federal Reserve officials call the hard reset, the complete abandonment of the current monetary system and the introduction of a new currency, possibly digital, possibly backed by assets, possibly controlled in ways that would make cash obsolete and financial privacy a memory. This isn't theoretical. The Federal Reserve has been testing central bank digital currency systems for over 2 years. They call it research, but the infrastructure being built suggests something far more immediate than research typically requires. All 3 scenarios were modeled for the year 2026. The timeline is not arbitrary. 2026 marks several critical convergences that make systematic breakdown almost inevitable. It's the year Social Security and Medicare trust funds are projected to be exhausted, requiring either massive tax increases or benefit cuts that would be politically impossible. It's the year interest payments on the national debt are projected to exceed defense spending by such a margin that America will face a choice between funding its military or funding its creditors. But there's something else about 2026 that Federal Reserve officials discussed extensively in their meetings. It's the year the baby boomer generation reaches peak retirement, creating unprecedented pressure on government spending, precisely when the government can least afford it. 7 million Americans will turn 65 in 2026 alone. Each one represents tens of thousands of dollars in additional government obligations at the exact moment when the government is running out of ways to pay for existing obligations. Most importantly, 2026 is when the Treasury will need to roll over the largest amount of government debt in American history. Nearly $8 trillion in government bonds will mature and need to be refinanced. If foreign creditors lose confidence in America's ability to repay, if they demand higher interest rates, if they simply decide to stop lending, the entire system collapses in a matter of weeks. Federal Reserve modeling suggests they have a 90-day window from the first signs of creditor reluctance to complete systemic breakdown. Federal Reserve officials aren't just aware of this timeline, they're counting on it. The secret meetings weren't just about crisis response. They were about crisis management. The difference is crucial. Crisis response assumes the system can be saved. Crisis management assumes the system will fail and focuses on controlling how it fails. Federal Reserve documents obtained through congressional subpoenas reveal they've been wargaming the collapse scenario since 2019. They have detailed plans for bank closures, account freezes, and capital controls. They've studied how other nations managed currency collapses and have adapted those playbooks for American conditions. This is why regional banks have been quietly increasing their cash reserves beyond regulatory requirements. This is why the Federal Reserve has been conducting stress tests that model scenarios far worse than anything seen since the Great Depression. This is why Treasury officials have been having quiet conversations with allied nations about post-dollar arrangements. They're not trying to prevent the crisis. They're trying to survive it. The most chilling aspect of these preparations is how they're being conducted in plain sight. Federal Reserve officials discuss financial stability in public speeches. They mention the need for monetary system flexibility in academic papers. They reference the importance of crisis preparedness in congressional testimony. Jerome Powell himself has spoken repeatedly about the need for what he calls operational readiness for tail risk events. The Federal Reserve Bank of New York has quietly expanded its crisis management facilities. They've hired additional staff specifically for emergency operations. They've upgraded their communications systems to function during what they term severe financial stress scenarios. They're telling us exactly what they're planning. They're just not explaining what it means. When the Federal Reserve talks about flexibility, they mean the ability to abandon the current system. When they discuss stability, they mean the management of instability. When they mention preparedness, they mean preparation for events they know are coming. The 2026 crisis won't be a surprise to the people who matter. It will be the controlled execution of a plan that has been years in the making. Federal Reserve officials have been quietly coordinating with major financial institutions to ensure orderly transitions. The largest banks have been stress-tested, not for survival, but for their ability to implement emergency protocols designed to protect institutional wealth while managing public panic. History shows us that central banks don't prevent financial collapses. They manage them. They decide who gets saved and who gets sacrificed. They determine which assets retain value and which become worthless. They choose the winners and losers in the new system that emerges from the ashes of the old one. The Federal Reserve's secret meetings weren't about saving the American economy. They were about deciding what will replace it. Every empire reaches a moment when the cost of maintaining the illusion exceeds the benefit. Rome reached that moment when it couldn't pay its legions. Britain reached that moment when it couldn't defend its colonies. America is reaching that moment now, when it can't service its debt. The difference is that Rome and Britain fell slowly, over decades. America's fall will be swift, measured in months rather than years, because the systems that support modern economies move at digital speed. When confidence breaks in the age of electronic banking, capital flight happens in milliseconds, not months. The Federal Reserve knows this. They've run the models. They've held the meetings. They've made their preparations. The infrastructure is ready. The plans are written. The only variable left is timing. The question isn't whether the system will break. The question is what happens to the people who believed it never would.